Hello and welcome to the Nirvana Principle Show. My name is Hassan Mallick. I'm a doctor who's training in psychiatry. I'm also an electronic musician. I'm based here in the northwest of England. Melodic Distraction have been kind enough to provide me with a space to discuss psychological concepts with you. This episode is on psychedelics. They're also called hallucinogens, from hallucinare to wander in the mind manifesting. They're called entheogens. We thought we could deconstruct some of the myths and legends around it and try to show you why scientists are so excited about this drug and the potential it holds for the human mind. Here in the studio, I've invited to share his knowledge Dr. Maruf Mustapha, who's a member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. He hails from Lagos, Nigeria, where he has experience working in mental health services such as addiction, and has received training in South Africa on using psychedelics for psychotherapy.
Hello, listeners. Good evening. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you here, Hassan.
And a pleasure to have you in the studio. There was an important heads up that we wanted to give before we start the show. Muffy, you want to take this one?
So we have chosen to talk about this very interesting topic of psychedelics from a position of responsibility and from a position of education as well. We obviously know the baggage that comes with discussions around this. We have thought amongst ourselves that who is better qualified to talk about this than us to give general information to the public. This should not be seen as us condoning wanton and indiscriminate use of psychedelics, not in adults and especially not in children whose minds and brains are still developing. Listen with caution, and if you do need individual advice, because this is just a general conversation, please speak with your doctors or speak with your psychiatrist about moving things forward for yourself. We cannot give specific advice on this show because it's just general information. Thank you. Conversations we see on social media, on popular news nowadays, actor trying ayahuasca, this other person is doing some other hallucinogenic, and they all fit into this well-being theme. And it's spoken about in very good light in society nowadays, as opposed to a few decades back. So quite interesting, these questions we get asked, and we just thought, how about we have a very open, candid conversation about this, share some of the information and knowledge and research available to us.
Okay, so can you tell me what you understand by hallucinogens?
Hallucinogens, different categorizations, different ways to say the same thing. Some will call it the flesh of the gods. Some will call it acid, mind-bending, mind-altering. Some would even call it the psychotomimetics, that is mimicking frank psychotic breakdown.
Yeah, and entheogen is a word which seems to crop up. I haven't heard of that one before.
Yeah, and that is, I think, is one of the more interesting ways to talk about these molecules that we're talking about. Entheogen means God-generating.
So I guess entheogen is rituals and practices. A lot of it is to do with communication with a different dimension or the divine, or it seems to be themes which crop up quite often. One of the early proponents, or one of the early experiments, was to do more with divinity and theology with LSD, which became quite famous, and it's now called the Marsh Chapel experiment, or...
Yeah, the Good Friday experiment.
Yeah.
Very interesting chapter in the history of, in the modern history of psychedelics. Our dear friend, so to speak, Timothy Leary supervised one of his PhD students in the Harvard Divinity School, and they administered LSD. We'll come to what LSD is in a bit, to a couple of PhD level students who were studying to become
A bunch, actually, I think. Yeah. So they, so this person heard that the LSD had entered, this is the 50s, if I'm not mistaken, and
Yes.
LSD had entered the, what should I say, the Western diaspora or Western conversation on the back of its synthesization by Albert Hoffman and some articles published in Life magazine.
Yeah.
Was this around about Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley time as well?
Yeah, Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley was also something, an epoch of sorts. I mean, describing this, the last wave of the psychedelic era before things got a bit heated. The war on drugs was launched by the Nixon administration, different colorations to the reasons for that. Some say racist undertones, a couple of drugs that were being researched then that had shown immense potential or some potential in taking care of some mental health conditions were carpet bombed under this alleged war on drugs.
Yeah, I mean, this figure that we're talking about, Timothy Leary and the Mars Chapel experiment, the overtone I got from researchers was that they don't really like this man, and they feel that initially this Harvard professor, after doing these experiments, was eventually kicked out of Harvard because he was pretty much giving LSD to anyone.
And imprisoned as well.
Yep, and later on in prison. But between like doing the experiment and going to prison, he also became part of counterculture, and he had the slogan, turn on, tune in, drop out.
Yeah.
Almost like, let's say, a radical approach to changing society. And there was this genuine belief that if everyone took it, there would be no war, there would be like all what you see in the 60s and how it's glamorized in Hollywood, I would say.
Yeah. And what we had instead was a concerted effort by the powers that be then, using various tools of media to blacklist these molecules, these substances, be it from the chemically synthesized LSDs and the other ones to the more naturally occurring substances.
Yeah, the Life magazine, which first published one of the first articles on psilocybin, psychedelics in Western culture. The same magazine 10 years later, after that article, did another front page story about the dangers of psilocybin and psychedelics. So it seems like within a decade there was an about turn. We're not necessarily here to discuss the geopolitics of it, but the realities of the world we live in enroached on a scientific curiosity on this.
And what has happened since then, in the late 60s and the 70s, is there's been a decline to a dearth of any meaningful research into what had shown significant promise as tools in the psychiatric and mental health armamentarium. It's only just of recent, over the past 10, 15 years, there's been a sort of renaissance into these psychedelic space. And that's what we're here to talk about briefly as well today.
What happened in the 70s, like Muffy was saying, is that in 71, the UN passed a convention basically scheduling LSD as a dangerous drug, as a Schedule 1 drug. They have basically their class according to how addictive or how toxic they are. And they go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 being the most toxic, most dangerous. It's supposed to have no medical use. So what that means is that the only reason that you could possess LSD would be for research purposes. It also means that if you have this substance, you can get a hefty prison sentence or an unlimited fine as well.
And that's part of the social side effects of this topic we're talking about, that we do have to enlighten you listeners about. Having this conversation is in no way condoning illicit or irresponsible, non-supervised use of these substances. And we do owe you this note of warning.
The scheduling system in itself isn't it's there for a reason. So perhaps for me, a common Schedule drug I run into these days is a Schedule 2 drug. A Schedule 2 drug is a stimulant, an amphetamine. But yet I give it to kids, I can say. So I prescribe it for patients with ADHD, and it's more paperwork. I have to document that I've done this proficiently, and the actual way we write this prescription is different. You can't give this prescription, for example, more than 28 days.
Yeah.
They have to collect it. That's a maximum by law. I can prescribe it.
Yeah.
Simply because it's on the schedule, it does need to be monitored to that degree.
Interesting thing is that there's renewed conversations around the scientific rationale for this scheduling. So we're having high-level conversations up to the level of the parliament and potentially the cabinet on new emerging research that could potentially change the way these substances, molecules, especially the ones with medical potential, can be accessed and can be used by people who are in need of it, by psychiatrists, by mental health professionals.
Depends where you live. Oregon recently voted to decriminalize psilocybin. The running argument goes, I guess, that there are more avenues required to treat disorders where there seems to be a stalemate. An example would be things like
treatment-resistant depression.
Yeah, so if you've had like 2 or more antidepressants and it hasn't really helped your mood, which happens to a third of people who do take antidepressants.
Yeah.
So can psychedelics have an effect on treating that? We're going to come back in the next segment and talk to you about the effects of LSD and how it's improving our understanding of the mind and how those effects are being used or can be used to treat mental health disorders. There's been a comparison of how the telescope was for astronomy, how the microscope was for biology, and the psychedelics might be for psychiatry and study of the mind.
That analogy, and it's not one that is just of recent. It goes back to the days of Sigmund Freud and his cohort, who is reported had a lot of their psychoanalytic sessions whilst using some molecules to enhance understandings of the mind.
I hear Freud and I think of cocaine. Was that the substance that you were thinking about?
Oh, keep that his secret.
Okay, yes, no one knows.
Yeah.
So for us, we're interested in specifically the description of like id, ego, and superego because one of the ways that psychedelics are postulated, or I guess even some part of it's entered the modern lexicon as well, about things like ego death and how one dissolves a sense of self while experiencing the effects of these substances. I thought it would be interesting, Muffy, to talk about the effects of LSD on 3 levels. So we can talk to you about it on a completely neuroanatomical level, thinking about where does the blood go, what kind of impulses travel. We can also explain it on a psychological level, like with how it affects the ego. And last but not least, the psychopharmacology of it, what exact the molecules are and how they begin with.
Very well said. So maybe if we look at it from the neurobiological level, first of all, what that simply means is what happens in your brain when it's on.
Yeah, doctors love a long word where it's like, why make it simple? It's not stuff in the brain, it's neurobiology.
And then they can't spell it, that's why they scribble.
Guilty. Okay.
So what happens in the brain? We've been privileged to have access to modern tools of science, things like the magnetic resonance imaging, that's the brain scan essentially. But I can track activities going on in the brain. So very widely quoted research by Carhart Harris and his colleagues in the Imperial College led to a very interesting hypothesis or formulation of the default mode network in the brain and how this is affected by use of entheogens.
Talking about the default mode network, so what is that? What do you mean network? Where is this network?
Yeah. Neurons, or the brain cells that wire together.
So I guess they move in herds or they become used to certain routes of travel.
And then they just chatter amongst themselves like myself and you were talking without listening to other people around.
Yeah. Okay. So, I feel like the Muffy is telling me politely to shut up. So I'll let him continue.
And that's the analogy of it, really, and the jokes apart. So because we get into these zones in everyday life where things become very much routine, the brain optimizes for efficiency, just like with every other thing in nature. And these neurons find out that they oftentimes have something to say to each other, and they don't really get the full perception or the picture of every other thing else happening around them.
So picture this. You sit in your car. You just had a long day at work, or I don't know, maybe you're waiting for the bus, and you turn the ignition, sit down, look up, and you're back home. What happened in the middle? How did I get home? It was basically, we call it muscle memory, we call it routine, but your brain knows it's been through the same thing every day. It knows what to do, where to turn, where the speed cameras are. So, you're kind of used to it, and your brain's like, dude, why spend time and energy on this when it's already predictable? So the efficient way, as computers perhaps would work, would be to analyze the data and see how you can do the same process faster.
That comes at a cost, unfortunately, because we're not getting the full 360, full-on picture of what really is happening around us. We get stuck in these thinking patterns or these thinking loops or these perceptual loops. And that has significant effect on things like creativity or full experience. And in extremes where the brain optimizes for efficiency, it becomes very rigid, very stuck in particular thinking loops or patterns or habitual patterns. And those are the psychological and the neurobiologic underpinnings of conditions like depression or even post-traumatic stress disorder or even addictions.
If someone is depressed, what's happening to their default mode network?
So the default mode network is in overdrive, apparently. That's what happens. It's just stuck in the same old pattern. That's when you have people who say, I just can't get out of this. I'm stuck. It's like I'm in a rut. It's the same thing happening all over and all over again. And I'm not really moving forward. These are very common themes of expressions we get to hear in our clinics.
They have proven that when, like you said, with overdrive, so there is increased blood flow when you put them in a scan, when you do an MRI and just see where this is going. So more blood flow, more activity, the default mode network, or DMN as they call it, is more active. When you give psychedelics, this
controlled chaos.
Yeah, so it's reduced the rigidity, it's reduced the blood flow, reduced the activity there.
Yeah, the brakes are off, and then neurons from point A can fire with the ones they haven't been wired together with. They speak, they chatter all over the place. And in reference to the research we mentioned earlier, it's been shown that different parts of the brain light up very unusually, very randomly, almost like an entropy of sorts. And
what do you mean, entropy?
Yeah, what that means simply is that it makes the different nerve cells, different brain cells, the neurons, to interconnect in a very more variable way, more random.
To give you an example, a very classic one is something which we call synesthesia. And Muffy, I think you have a really great explanation. You're the one who told me exactly what it was. So
it's like smelling sounds.
So you're smelling colors and you're seeing sound, you know, so that means that the stuff like your optic nerves, your visual cortex is now talking to
the auditory cortex.
The auditory cortex. So it's basically your eyes talking to your ears and like, oh, wow, wait, this is what you do all day? Okay. You know, so they're like, so that in a way that's, I feel that explains a little bit about the creativity and the comparison to being like a child where you are experiencing everything again for the first time.
Yeah. Very interesting that you mentioned the experiences of childhood, because children, you often see them with smiles on their faces, very fascinated by every little thing they come across. The birds, the bees, the bugs, and the wind, the rain, everything is quite amazing to them. And it's there. But we as adults, we often grow numb to these things to a very high degree. And that's the brain optimizing for efficiency. That's the default mode network exerting its effect on how the brain communicates with itself. And like we said earlier, when this is in extremis, when it's too much, it leads to a lot of these problems that we have in the modern mental health space.
Okay, so we've covered. Okay, so we've covered that there's changes in blood flow. It goes to a specific area of the brain where the default mode network is, and that's a neural pathway which changes. So there are different electrical impulses in your brain which are being changed, and they're traveling to areas which they don't usually travel to.
And chemical impulses as well.
The chemical part in particular, is this molecule, when we say psychedelics, we're talking classic psychedelics, at least you and I, we're talking about things like mescaline, which
DMT.
is DMT, there's LSD and psilocybin. I think for us, we'll focus more on psilocybin and LSD because those are at least the studies I looked up. So,
yeah. And just for your information, psilocybin is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms.
Okay, so when you say active ingredient, you mean like, for example, THC is with cannabis?
Yeah. And one of the common pathways they all follow is they excite the serotonergic receptors.
That's the same serotonin which is reduced in depressed people. That's the same serotonin which gives you a sense of well-being.
Yeah, happiness.
But serotonin receptors are made for serotonin, which is a naturally occurring molecule. Are you saying that serotonin occurs in nature?
Oh, yeah. Serotonin does occur in nature very widely. It occurs in the human body very widely outside of the brain as well. Actually, I think there are more serotonergic receptors in the gut, in the abdomen, than even in the brain.
Second brain, so they say. At least for me, yeah. When I get hungry, that's the only part that's thinking. They mimic serotonin quite nicely. Our receptors, the landing sites for these spaceships, really love them. So they bind for quite a few hours.
It's like lock and key. They key into the lock of the serotonin receptors and they unlock it, and they allow the widespread effects of, say, serotonin molecule binding to those receptors for a longer period and even more potently as well. And that's why they produce these effects, some of which we will run through very briefly.
Mm-hmm. What about subjectively as a person, psychologically? How can I explain its effects?
So earlier we talked about the idea of how the mind and the body work together. We talked about things like the id, the ego, and the superego.
Simple way that I remember them is that id is the child, ego is the adult, and superego is the parent that we all carry within us.
Very correct.
Okay.
Putting that into context is the id is uncontrolled, pleasurable drives and desires. Like I want it here, I want it now. No sense of time, no sense of delayed gratification. Everything has to be here and now, just almost like a kid as well, like you've said. And then the ego comes along in psychological maturity, and he exerts sort of boundary around this id. It gives it some containment, well, for lack of a better word, some direction as well. But this comes at a cost as well, because these boundaries define the self, the persona, at the exclusion of perceiving things from other people's perspectives as well.
Ego also protects against the superego. Sometimes being too strict on yourself is also not the best thing you can do. So it's a balancing act, which unfortunately, fortunately, depending on your view, the ego is doing.
Cogito ergo sum.
Wow. I love my Latin. Okay, so what happens to this ego on psychedelics?
Hypothesis or the thinking generally accepted is that these boundaries created by the ego psychologically to define its sense of self at the exclusion of perception from other people's perspectives. These boundaries are lowered or crashed down, and there's this, some people describe it as an ego death of sorts, where you lose your sense of self and you sort of blend into others or the environments that you find yourself in. The perceptions are a lot more overflooding, for lack of a better word. There's much less control, but it's not a reversal back to the id state, so to speak.
Walls come down. There are parts of the brain physically communicating with each other that usually don't, without hindrance, without a mediator. Here, psychologically, again, your internal psychological mediator ego is also out of commission.
And some even propose the theory that the mirror neurons, those are the neurons, those are the nerves, those are the brain cells that can, interestingly, almost telepathically understand or feel what other people are feeling in their own mirror neurons, become more active. And what this means simply is that there's a lot more empathy, and that leads, interestingly, so these substances are sometimes called empathogens as well. There's a sense of keen connection to other people around and your environment and nature as well.
I think the mirror neurons, for once someone named something based on exactly what they do, it literally mirrors the other person's neurons. So their frequencies, you try to align with someone else's frequencies, and they're almost like in sync. And that in sync, not the band, is what causes this feeling. So I thought that was like mad interesting, that it's not just a subject, like the subjective feeling that you're getting is actually a consequence of the physical vibration.
And by the way, these are reports from people who have been exposed to these substances in controlled environments. They've given very, very apt descriptions of these experiences, and these can be found widely published in various medical journals and even non-medical media as well.
These are, as you can hopefully tell by now, these have profound effects on our body, on our soul, on our psyche. And they come with their own dangers as well as benefits, which we are going to talk to you about. There's this new book, which I'm very proud to own. It's the first edition. It's called Club Drugs and Novel Psychoactive Substances, the Clinician's Handbook. It's published by the Royal College, and they say under desired effects by user. Desired effects include euphoria, mild stimulation, enhanced appreciation of music and lights, visual distortion, intensification of sensual or sexual feelings, and altered sense of time and place.
That's an interesting long list.
Yeah, it doesn't sound very sexy, does it?
Some other more psychologic effects that have been described as hallmarks of sort of mystical experience that comes from the use of these entheogens, as described by Bill Richards and Pankey, include a sense of unity with self, with others, and with the environment, a sense of transcendence of time and space, like Hassan has rightly mentioned earlier, which is also experienced almost universally across people who've been reported to use, a deeply felt positive mood. Now that can be an either-or situation, a sense of sacredness, a sense of objectivity and reality, i.e. still having an insight, even though things seem to be very, very hallucinatory around you, a sense of paradoxicality, a a sense of alleged ineffability, transiency, and last but not the least is a persisting positive change in attitude and behavior. Some will say years and decades even after the use.
Okay, I definitely like your definition much more than mine. I thought that made it sound much more divine, as I guess entheogens mean, to search for the divine within.
Yeah.
Just to give you a balanced keel, the flip side of that, what are the side effects of using this? So we do know that generally in culture, people make the claim that there's no known overdose. You can't, it's not like cocaine or, like barbiturates, sleeping pills, which if you have too many, even paracetamol, which you can literally die from. There is an overdose, but it's the actual doses that they're used. For example, LSD is used in micrograms, which is a millionth of a gram for it to have like the desired effect. Doses used in studies for psilocybin, I think, is 10 milligrams, 25 milligrams.
Yeah.
The dangers are more to do with what you do once you feel the effects, rather than an overdose simply on the biological level. It can cause rare things which are dangerous. It can cause what we call serotonin syndrome.
Oh, yeah.
So that means that because it's activating serotonin, much like antidepressants, they can also have a rare but still dangerous side effect where they can cause too much serotonin to come, and then, it causes your blood pressure to go up, your
a run of fever,
and
your tummy.
Yeah, it's treatable. Obviously, no one wants to experience that, but it is treatable, and if it's identified within time. The other thing is that psychologically, if you're predisposed to schizophrenia, to psychosis, to mental health disorders, how do we know if someone is predisposed to that?
Decent background check running inclusion and exclusion criteria.
Yeah, so at any study, for example, if you're doing, you have to rule out certain things. If a drug has an effect on the heart, or it has a side effect on the heart, you wouldn't bring in someone who's had a stroke, for example, or someone who has had a heart attack. Here, it's more a family history of psychosis or schizophrenia. If there are people in the family of the what's the research participant?
Yeah.
Then
the person,
the individual, if someone is predisposed to this, it can, because of the entropy, the chaos that these molecules introduce into our brain. And there's already a lot of potential chaos there. They were just waiting for that, and you're pushed into psychosis where you no longer know what reality is, and it persists. But one particular long-term side effect is what they call HPPD, or I'll just get this wrong way, I wrote it down, hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. So it's long-lasting. There are two types. One is type 1, which colloquially is known as flashbacks. So that means that any point in the future after you have ingested a psychedelic substance, you can have experiences which seem very familiar, as if you are back on it.
Yeah.
Usually you can recognize them, and it's almost like a familiar feeling, and it goes away, and that's that. Sometimes it might come back. It's perceptible, but it doesn't really, let's say, harm you, or you are aware that, okay, I'm feeling a bit weird, but then you're back.
You still maintain reality testing.
Yep. On the other hand is the type 2 one, which is the endless trip. So that means that the perceptions are distorted for a time, and so everything looks like it's made of candy. Sounds not too bad, I guess, at some level, but then you are aware that this is not real, but you are aware that you are not seeing things as they are.
Sartre had a very bad experience about that one.
Yes.
Rather than seeing candy, he was seeing crabs and lobsters all over the place.
As I hope you know, I might know, Sartre is a French philosopher. And Jean-Paul Sartre, I hope I didn't butcher that pronunciation too much, probably did. But he injected himself with mescaline, which contains these psychoactive...
It's a classic psychedelic.
Yeah, and then he just saw all of these huge giant crabs or giant lobsters just following him around everywhere, and he knew that wasn't real, and he knew this was a side effect of mescaline. So it had nothing to do with insight. It's just that your perceptions are distorted and will remain distorted, as there is no known cure.
And it could be very scary.
Hopefully not too much Those are the dangers that you have to keep in mind while designing a study, apart from the scheduling of the drug itself and the socio-political aspects of it, that you are working with profound, dangerous substances.
I mean, it seems to me almost like the psychological side effects are more, obviously, clearly more than the physical harms it could do to one. And that's why a lot of attention has to be paid to the psychological settings before one can be advised to use these medications.
Yeah, and I guess one of the, well, we didn't call it a side effect, but one of the negative effects would be that the experiences that you do have are horrifying. You don't understand it, what is colloquially known as a bad trip.
A bad trip.
So that doesn't really harm you on a physical level, but the experiences that you have, the visions, the time distortion, all of those things that you're experiencing traumatize you basically, and it's not a good experience. You know why it's there. You've used some substances, or you've ingested something which is alien to you, but then still, just because you understand doesn't mean that it won't have a potent effect on your psyche. You're listening to the Nirvana Principle Show on Melodic Distraction Radio. We're here in our final segment, and I thought it would be good to tell you what kind of results we're getting. Generally, for the mood disorder treatment, such as the treatment-resistant depression, they've shown a large treatment effect. That means that generally people do feel that their depression has reduced, and this is on the back of, depending on the study, could be a single dose of psilocybin or 2 doses about a week apart, assisted with psychotherapy. So psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is what they call it, and that involves a emotional confrontation where the patient or the user is able to basically face their pain, and they're able to visualize things.
Obviously, like we've mentioned earlier, there's a recall of repressed, sometimes childhood memories. It comes to the fore, and it gives that opportunity to psychologically audit yourself and reprocess these memories into more adaptable forms. And you can box them away that are unresolved, are still affecting our daily understandings or interactions. You have the opportunity when these come up in these sessions to reprocess, to re-audit them.
And obviously this is with the help of a trained psychotherapist. So participants meet this therapist before, during they are in the room as well if they want to talk, as well as one day after their trip or experience or treatment. And they go through what they've experienced and the things that they saw and what it means to them. I was also interested in its applications outside psychiatry and some of the research that has been done around divinity and these experience of altered consciousness or connection with a higher power. Muffy, you want to tell us a bit about that?
For those who are religiously or spiritually inclined, there is a heightened sense of an aura or mysticism about it. It does put you in touch with, you feel something greater than yourself being present and prescient, being all around you. And this was keenly illustrated in the Mass Chapel or the Good Friday experiment that our dear friend from the 60s, 50s, Timothy Leary.
So the Marsh Chapel experiment or Good Friday experiment was actually done by students, by individuals at Harvard and students of divinity and theology. And the idea was to see whether an artificial substance can induce a spiritual experience and bring people closer to God.
Yeah, they did. It was a sort of qualitative and quantitative assessment of what postgrad theology students would attribute to being a divine experience. And they charted things like unity, transcendence of time and space, a deeply felt positive mood, a sense of sacredness. And other things they checked for were also persistent positive changes in attitude and behavior. These theology students, they rated the use of LSD as one of the most profound mystical spiritual experiences they had ever experienced. And not only at that point of assessment, even many decades afterwards, when they were revisited by Rick Dublin, they still rated this as a very significant life event, which goes on to show how long, for lack of a better expression, how long acting the effects of a properly orchestrated psychedelic therapy can be.
Researchers have tried to compare this with an actual SSRI or an antidepressant. They call it escitalopram, the one that was studied. This was, I think, the results came out this year, if I'm not mistaken, and they didn't show any significant difference in the antidepressant effect between using psilocybin and using the SSRI I mentioned, escitalopram. However, one does have to keep in mind that there are two different approaches. A medication you would have to have every day versus a single episode of treatment, which could potentially have effects for months. I think personally it would depend on the side effects felt. Another recent study, Muffy, the results came out last week from Compass Pathways, which is a private company looking to use psilocybin to treat mental health disorders. They did a phase 2B trial. They did all of the stuff which makes a study robust. And it did show promise in improving mood, but mixed reviews because it also had some adverse events for people putting themselves in danger or were a risk to themselves as well. There are lights on the horizon, but we have to be cautious in how quickly, if at all, we approach these molecules.
Yeah, I think it does hold promise for the future of treatment of many mental health conditions. As the studies get into bigger numbers, we get more research, more reproducible research into this.
We're right about almost out of time. Muffy, it's been a pleasure having you. And thank you so much for taking your time out and sharing your experience and knowledge with us.
Thank you very much. It's always interesting having a chat with you.
And a special thank you to those who asked us questions about this episode prior to the show. And you are also welcome to reach out on our socials on Instagram or Twitter. We are there as nirvana.principle. We welcome suggestions for new shows or topics we should cover. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Until next time.